Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here today with Joan Morgenstern. Joan is the Director of Parent Education and Community Outreach for Senders Pediatrics. And I think you mentioned you're trained in conscious discipline.
Mm-hmm. I
Okay,
am trained.
I love that. That's why you give us such great information, and your years of dealing with parents as a preschool director also.
Correct.
Okay, so our topic today is consequences, and mostly around the idea that we are all just at a loss for what to do. I totally forgot to do my usual things to turn off sound. Anyway, so getting back to the people that are here to hear what Joan has to say, I actually want to start with the question, what's the difference between punishment and consequence?
So that is a great question, Sue, and I think that's absolutely the place to start. And I think we use those words very interchangeably as though they're synonymous, when actually they have very different intentions. So let's break that down just a little bit. So when we think in terms of punishment, and of course that word begins with the letter P, the easiest way to make an association is punishment can be associated with power over or punitive. When we're punishing children, we're usually in this place of, I'm asserting my power. I'm going to do something punitive in a way to help motivate you to do something different or better in the future. And that usually doesn't bode well. Not only doesn't it bode well for teenagers, it doesn't bode well for 2-year-olds either, nor adults. It just feels very unfair. Consequences, on the other hand, are really intended to teach. The goal of a consequence is to teach a child a skill that they don't have, so that in the future they can find a better way of addressing a situation, a predicament, an expectation more successfully and differently. And what's confusing about it is children don't like punishments, and nor do they like consequences. Your teenager will not say to you, Mom, you really nailed this consequence. That is going to be so beneficial to help me be my better self the next time this comes out. Consequences and punishments typically have a very similar kind of emotional reaction from teens. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel comfortable. It certainly isn't going the way that they want. But there's a very big difference. A consequence is done is done in the context of it being relatable to a child's transgression, where punishment is done to be punitive to a child's transgression. And the best way for me to explain it would be if we take assume you're driving along the road and you are driving 55 in a 35-mile speed limit and you just happen to get pulled over. Well, the natural consequence of your action is that you're going to receive a ticket, a no-brainer there. Are you going to be happy about that? No. Are you going to feel frustrated? Yes. Might you grumble out loud or under your breath? Probably, without a question of a doubt. But does part of you recognize that that is what the consequence, or what happens when you don't follow the rules of the road? Part of you is going to accept that as reasonable. If in that situation, though, you got pulled over and after you were given a ticket, then somebody said, now get out of your car and kneel, or put you in handcuffs, or decided to search your car, all of a sudden that assertion of power over feels very much in violation to the transgression. And then that asks for retaliation or revenge.
Okay, well, that was great. So helpful. And I love that you told us our kids aren't going to thank us, because sometimes when we do a better way, we want to hear from our kids that was better.
And for sure, they won't thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's give some examples of times where, we're setting boundaries on phone and screen time right now, for example. Or, you may have totally given up right now, but let's say at some point in our raising teenagers, we are trying our best to set some guidelines and boundaries on technology use. Now, do we set up consequences beforehand? And the follow-up question is, how do we enforce them?
Right. So I absolutely think that you need to set them up ahead of time. And the other is that I think you need to have conversations and conversations that include compromise. So what is a compromise? It's, I'm open to hearing how you feel about this. Your feelings around the technology are important to me. I want to hear why it's relevant to you. I want to hear how it supports your needs. I don't want to be judgmental about it. Those conversations have to be open. They have to say that even if I disagree with you, you have a platform for sharing your feelings with me, and your feelings and thoughts around this are legitimate. And then we move, when we're working through compromise, we can say, this is what's important to me. You stated what's important to you. We need to figure out a middle ground, something that we can both live with. So that sometimes is a very appropriate strategy. If it's feeling like this, there is no compromise in this, and this is just the decision that I'm making as kind of captain of this family, and whether they like it or not, there's compliance is expected, then we need to discuss this in advance. The worst time to reveal it would be in the heat of the moment. And we say, for these reasons, this is the decision I've made. And even when we do that, we can give lots of latitude for, I bet I understand this isn't how you would do it right now if you were a parent. Perhaps 15 years from now or 20 years from now, when you become a parent, this still won't be the way that you do it. And I understand that you would like it done differently. And this is the way that it is going to be done.
Okay, so that I'm all on with all of that. I think I could do that. But then what happens when the consequence is really hard to enforce?
Mm-hmm.
And
So
you
give
don't
me
want to get into a fist fight or a tug of war over the technology.
Right. And so then what can you do? So some of it is like when kids, and that's different than when you're working with younger kids, when you can still kind of corral them, even if you have to physically take them up to their bedroom. It gets harder with teens. And the goal here is to be able to say, when a child is incredibly resistant to it, it's what you want to do is you want to say, I'm going to give you a little space to cool off, and we're going to get back to this. I mean, you have to kind of evaluate the situation. Can I actually take the phone and remove it? The important thing about phones is we want to remove phones only when they're transgressions related to the phones. Phones tend to be this: my child didn't come home in time and now I'm taking the phone away. My child backmouthed me and now I'm taking their phone away. My child didn't do chores and now I'm taking my phone away. Really, taking the phone away is only effective and only going to help reinforce the importance of using the phone correctly or the technology correctly when it's connected specifically to transgressions around the phone or other forms of technology. So some of it comes down to, if teens aren't paying their own phone bills, I suppose that's one level of leverage. That's kind of like, in order to have a phone, we have to be able to pay the bill. And until you absorb this as your personal expense, again, with phone transgressions, then it becomes something that I control and I have power over it. But I think that you really want to set the stage. You want to do your prep work as much as you can in advance so that the teen understands that this is what the consequence is going to be for the transgression. And if it gets into a big brawl, your opportunity is, okay, we both need some space and we're going to come back to this.
So the problem for me as a parent is always when I do all of the things leading up the right way, at least what I consider to be the right way. I sit with my kid, I talk through, like, I understand them, I want to hear their opinion, I do all of those things you just suggested. And then I think I've done a formula for success. And so when the consequences aren't followed, I now fall into that place of being really mad. And now I want to say, okay, I'm the boss of you, and here's how it's going to go. And that just escalates the whole thing. But what's the alternative?
So the alternative, I think, is really, again, giving yourself a little bit of space. And then some of it is going to say is, I'm going to have to assert this. So if you can kind of give me an example a little bit, you set up a consequence, and then the child isn't game on. We don't expect kids to be game on for the consequence. That would be unrealistic for them to say, hey, here's my phone. fine, like take it from me. It's the idea of like, I'm going to get that. You can either give that to me or I will find a way to take it from you when you're without your consent. And we set ourselves up for doing it, for being able to. So if you can kind of even share with me a little bit more of an example of like having a consequence in place, but a child being resistant and not feeling like you have the authority to step in.
I mean, I think, like, I'll just think of one example, but it to me, it ends up being that P again. At the end of all of that, what it ends up being is, I'm mad. I don't, you're not listening to me. And so now we're not fighting about the issue. We're fighting about the effective, like actually the consequence.
Correct. And that actually creates a very stimulating engagement, and sometimes is a big distractor, at least for the teen too. But that can also take you down a slippery slope. So what do you do with it? Think in terms a little bit like one of those Chinese puzzles, those finger puzzles. Are you familiar with what those look like? You kind of both put your finger in and then both people's fingers are stuck. And the beautiful thing about that, it takes two people to operate that puzzle. If your teen's got their finger stuck into the puzzle, you don't put your finger in there. And when at some level what it is you cease the engagement. Sometimes we get into this that we're reasonable. We've revealed this to you in advance. You understood what was going to happen. In fact, it was of your volition that you find yourself in this uncomfortable predicament. And we want then our teen to be reasonable back to us. Well, all bets off on that. In fact, you can expect that they won't find that reasonable, even at the moment, if they agree to it. So then we stop the engagement. We stop trying to convince them that this is their fault or they got themselves into this. In fact, we actually flip the switch. We either cease the engagement, kind of like pull the plug, so no energy is getting communicated, or we do, I see this is really hard. It isn't going the way you want it. You don't even feel, even though we agreed upon it, that this is fair. And I hear that. And I understand how that would feel like that to you.
Well,
so we use our empathy.
Yeah, what I guess is that it's not a win or lose. Like if you need to win, then you're playing that game of the dolls. And if you don't need to win, but you want to teach something, then you're going to back off. So I think that's a really great point, but really, really hard.
It is really hard because we get all emotional about it.
Right. Yeah, no,
and when our teens are upset, it upsets us too. We're thinking, why are we at this again? Why can't there be a moment of peace? Like I'm just recovering from the last episode that we went through. This is exhausting and we wish it didn't. And we work towards this. I want to convince you I'm reasonable. And when we stop having to convince them that we're being reasonable, then we actually take a whole layer of like kind of energy. We release energy that isn't there. It's like, oh, it isn't my job to convince you I'm doing the right thing. And it isn't your job to convince me to change my mind.
Okay, well, let's first of all, Doris says it's really hard when you have a 16-year-old, which of course, yes, it gets near impossible. So let's move to like the nagging stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So, we've been with our kids for a long time now, and some of it is that, we're just throwing our arms up in the air and saying, I can't deal with this anymore. And some of it is like, we can't live like this anymore. Like, we need everybody to up their game and to help out with the chaos of the house. Mm-hmm. So any suggestions on how that can be effective?
So some of it is like, how do you find moments during the week when everybody kind of is at peace with one another? I mean, I think that some of it is like we have this tendency toward negativity bias. Both our teens do, we do. I mean, all humans, that we notice what's not working versus what is working. And so we want to kind of flip that switch a little bit too. We want to notice. I mean, our brains kind of tune off when our kids aren't giving us grief, right? They kind of tune on when like things are going awry and everything is kind of like unraveling. So we really need to begin to kind of shift our focus to notice when are those calm moments and how do we kind of build from them? How do we kind of comment about like what is working and how we help our teens to recognize that we also have needs and that they can be supportive, or they can be contributors to our family. It isn't likely that they'll say like, yes, that makes me feel really good, but like what's contrary to what most parents believe, like teens aren't in this to make their parents miserable. They're in this because they're in their own kind of world, figuring everything out amidst the chaos that and all of the conflicts and challenges that they're experiencing. So sometimes when we open up to them appropriately about our own vulnerabilities or about our own kind of needs, as opposed to kind of feeling like we're always take charge and we're always kind of dictating what needs to get done, that we appeal to that more empathetic part of them that's like kind of like, yeah, right, I'll help, I see that, I care about you too. It's not that they stop caring, it's that their caring just kind of isn't visible as much.
Okay, so I'm going to bring up a question not on this topic, but someone asked us, and I said I would ask you. So, and I think this is common right now with kids starting to go back to school, and maybe not everybody in your class at the same time. So her kid, he doesn't want to go because the way they did the alphabet, his friends aren't
Mm-hmm.
going to school when he goes to school.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do with that? And I'll get to questions if you guys put them in the comments. We'll get to them.
So I think the most is that, like, so you can't necessarily change kind of how the school pods or the school days are separated, but I certainly think it gives great opportunity to kind of open up communication and to be really curious. Sometimes we move from hearing what our kids say into let's discuss solutions to them or pragmatic ways of kind of dealing with it. Well, you can see them after school, or maybe you'll find new people to connect to, or all of those kind of like, yes, I want this to be in a more comfortable place. I think when our kids struggle, the opportunity is that perhaps there's space to really get to know them a little bit better, to get to hear about that. That's really interesting. Tell me about it. Help me understand, not in a judgmental way. If we come in trying to feel judgmental, we will sabotage any opportunity for open communication. But when we say, wow, you're learning something about yourself, that school feels more, is it more enjoyable, or you have more people that you can kind of fall back on if you're confused or kind of need to work something through, like, how do I help you? And when we leave space for that, we deepen our connection with our kids. We give them more clarity about what's driving some of those emotions. And hopefully through that process that they can see it's incredibly imperfect, but they're able to do it anyways.
And then is there room to brainstorm with them how they could navigate their day so that it's not so terrible?
Correct, absolutely. And I think you have to, and I think the brainstorming comes after the curiosity. I think we have to stay in that space of like, I'm really curious. I'd like to learn more about that. Tell me more about that. Anything else you can let me know, that we really want to help them, because it's in their ability as well to communicate it, that they see. Is it just that they feel like an outsider with the people that they're in? Is it that they were reliant on their peers to help them in a way that nobody's kind of there right now? Is it that school feels stressful and wow, without having comfortable peeps that you can kind of just be yourself with, it adds to the stress? And that's where the curiosity is super beneficial, because it allows us to learn more and it allows our child to kind of become more self-aware. And then the let's brainstorm this and let's figure this out and I'm here to help is super important.
It just all sounds so kind. Like, I mean, no, we really, like, I went at a lot of this being angry, but instead of being angry and trying to understand where they're coming from, there's like it takes away the air from the fight. Okay, so Nikki wants to know your thoughts when fights are centered around grades and lack of motivation for high school teens, which, of course, you know, how could we not all be dealing with that right now?
Right. And I think here too, it's kind of like, you know, we go into this like at how much can we control? And I think control is a really compelling topic. It's like we all would like to control, because by being able to control, we feel safe. And when we feel safe, we can relax and feel like things are going to unfold in a more predictable way. But the truth is, like, control is kind of an illusion that we actually never have. We don't have it with anyone other than ourselves. So when we're talking about grades, or we're talking about who our children choose to associate with, or we're talking about their level of motivation, I think that really we have to shift from what can I control to how do I influence this? And one of the interesting things is when our children aren't doing what we want them to do, a few things are happening. One is that we might think, they're really underperforming. They're really slacking off. They're not really working to their capability. And that's kind of on a very superficial, pragmatic level. Another thing that it does for us as parents under the surface is it begins to bring up a lot of fear. What if they're underperforming means that they will lose opportunities to be successful in getting into college or in career options or in all of these things? And our fears and our kind of dominance in wanting to control really begins to erode healthy relationships. And we have to start with, the only thing we can really do is we can influence how we can influence our children. And our influence, even when they roll their eyes and stomp their feet and mumble under their breath, still is a very, very compelling way that we teach them about who they are, what we believe is very important. And I think one of the caveats there is when kids aren't doing well in school, we need to say to them, how is that working for you? Can you see that this could, perhaps not now, but later on, feel problematic? Have you ever regretted something in the past? Would you think that it would be good for me to just say, it's school, whatever you want to do, you don't want to study? No big deal, that doesn't bother me. Could that feel uncomfortable at another time? We have to kind of be curious about how this is working for them. And then we have to say again, the expectation is that you do this, because that is where what we believe is very important. But we can't force them to do it. We can only influence that journey. And the more we tell them that we know they have the capability of being a good student versus being irresponsible or not academically motivated, the more we can say to them, you're not performing well now, but I know your capability is. I know that you care how well you do, even though you're not showing it now, allows them to see that as their potential.
Yeah, and it's just so especially hard right now. I mean, there's just like, it's hard to be motivated in anything right now, not just for kids in school. Okay, Zainab has a question. It sounds like test anxiety. We deal with stress and feeling not confident before going to tests, even if they studied hard for the test.
Mm-hmm. And so some of it is to understand and to be able to help them to onboard stress reducing strategies such as the deep breathing and whatever to help calm and regulate that central nervous system. The other is, in those cases, we want to say how you do on your test doesn't define who you are as a person. So we want to make sure that you give it your very best shot. You recognize, I always say when kids have anxiety, the gift of anxiety is that we teach them to pay attention to the signals that their body is giving them. It's not like, oh, we wish our children have anxiety, but it isn't something that we choose for them. So once they have it, we say, wow, what strategies have you learned to help? Is it that you do the deep breathing to calm your central nervous system? Is that you do the positive affirmations to say you're doing the very best that you can, and that's what's important? And then we too come in with the reassuring voice. How you do doesn't define you as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can see with one of my kids, like the de-stressing techniques that she's working on right now will serve her for the rest of her life. So there's always stress. Okay, so Christina, so her kid's friend group is not very academic, but her kid was academic, and she wants to make sure that who she's associating with isn't impacting how the performance.
And that's a very real concern. And your best opportunity there a little bit is like, especially as kids start to change peer groups and begin to experiment. I call it a little bit like taste other flavors, so to speak. It's kind of like, wow, I'm curious about how this group is, or these are the people I am aligning to now. Well, we have to bring these conversations comfortably to children's attention. The other thing we want to notice, or we want to be able to utilize, is contrast is a great teaching opportunity. So we sometimes think like same feels safer. It just does. If my child, it surrounds themselves with people that are more similar to my child, that feels familiar, that feels comfortable, that makes me feel safe. And I'm not arguing with that at all. But sometimes when we don't have those choices, or our children are gravitating outside of a certain circle, then we rely on contrast, and we use contrast as a way to spark meaningful conversation. So what do you notice about your friends? Why do you think they're not so interested? How is it that you can maintain your interest and vigor even when you are with people that have other things that they like to do? Could you see that being a problem for them? So again, contrast can be a great learning opportunity. We want to create meaningful reciprocal conversations with children. And I use the word reciprocal because so often we talk at children as opposed to with children. And our children tend to be pretty wise, wiser than they actually, wise on many, many levels, also evolving on other very kind of physiological levels and brain development levels. But they have insights, and we want to tap into those. In fact, we want to think of them as wise even when they're not using their wisdom, so that we can bring those things forward as opposed to bringing the control. If control worked, then it would be an easy thing to do, but it doesn't. In fact, it does the exact opposite.
Yeah, that's great advice. And so all of this is just so hard. I think I've said that way too many times, but it is. So Laura has a story that I think so many families experience, where she and the dad don't have the same parenting style.
Mm-hmm.
And he is the because I said so kind of parent. And her teenage son and the dad are butting heads like elk in the wild. I love that. So this is, I think, more about how does she talk to her husband about the best way to deal with their son.
That's a really tricky one because I think where you probably have more common ground as a couple would likely be more in terms of what your intentions are. So we often have similar intentions, which is I want my child to grow up to be a responsible, respectful, contributing human being. Most parents share that in common. I think one of the challenges is the strategies perhaps that they use in order to achieve that bigger picture. So one would be like that this is, I have a heavy hand and I kind of lay down the law and you do it because I said that you did do it. The other is kind of like, I care about your person and I understand this is a collaboration or relationship that we're in that requires both of us to kind of hear each other's voices. So again, I think it's helpful when you start with, wow, our intention is the same. What people don't ever appreciate is being criticized for the way that they do things. So I think it's like, are you open to hearing why I do it the way that I do it? And I think one of the biggest issues, at least it has been in my work with parents, and I get that a lot with coaching when I suggest kind of different types of interactions, and parents will say like, well, my parents never did that with me, and I came out perfectly okay. And by perfectly okay, that means like I'm a responsible human being and I earn an income that can help support and contribute to our family or whatever it is. And I said, it's so confusing for parents when how they were parented, and they feel like, yeah, it may have not been perfect parenting, but I feel really comfortable with how I turned out. And it's kind of like, well, why are you telling me that this is not the right way to do it with our children or other, in my case, when I work with clients? And I say, because 21st century living is completely different than it was when parents were children. There isn't anything about the way we live that is similar to how the environment and context in which we grew up, and all of you kind of grew up. And we have to take that into consideration. And children are so much more exposed to differences of opinion. I mean, the media exposure, the difference of opinion, even the way families function and the discourse spouses have with one another is totally different than it was, let's say, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago when spouses engaged with each other. So it kind of goes to how we were parented, even when we came out the way we perfectly comfortable with that, might not be relevant for how to parent children today. But criticizing someone's approach is never the right strategy. The idea of it's the same conversation we're having with our kids. I appreciate what we both want, and how might we be able to compromise or understand that there are different ways of achieving that.
The techniques work for all relationships.
Correct.
And I can just tell you, Christina, telling your spouse that they're doing it wrong, it never really worked for me. Okay, so this is a serious one. Normally we try to keep these under 30 minutes, but this is a serious one, so I want to bring it up. Feline has a 14-year-old daughter with ADD. And now that she's at home, she doesn't feel like she has to be held accountable for anything. If she doesn't get what she wants, she automatically starts saying she wants to kill herself.
Mm-hmm.
So they're all walking on eggshells, and she's running the house. Even the younger siblings are taking the brunt of her verbal abuse. And then Valerie said, I feel you. We have the same issues here. So I don't want to let that one go. It's serious. Mm-hmm. So Joan, what do you have to say?
Right. So a few things. I mean, I think we always have to take children's threats of self-harm very seriously. And that really would be, how might you reach out for professional help for that? You also have to balance between, is she doing that because these are truly feelings that she has, or is she doing this because she recognizes when she says these things, it shifts the kind of energy in the house and she's able to get her way? That could not be something I could tell you. But I think when we are concerned that children may be committing self-harm or thinking about that, we want to seek outside professional resources for that. The other is, and I completely understand, and you speak from a very vulnerable position, it is, we all walk on eggshells around the house. And that is a yucky place to be. And I think one of the places to practice, in addition to seeking professional guidance, would be is, how can you feel like you're in command even when you don't necessarily feel like you're in command? So how do you fake it until you make it? And my MO is, how do you show up like a first responder? And what do I mean by a first responder? The energy of a first responder is they don't get squeamish. They don't say, oh my God, look what you did. They don't get not a lot of hilaria around it. They're just kind of like, my energy is even around that. And my position is, I'm here to help. And it's this kind of exerting kind of the sense of authority without being overly authoritarian about it. It's just, I've got this and we're in command. And if you don't feel like you've got this, you've got to get other people in your camp to help you with that. So that's the kind of energy that's being exerted in the house.
Okay, and they're both saying that their kids have therapists already. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's an attention-seeking behavior, but even if you think that, can you ignore it?
Well, can you ignore it? I mean, so what do you do if you don't ignore it? One of the things that you have to say is, all behavior has some payout. And again, this is in no way to diminish or to be unalarmed by a child who is threatening for self-harm. We absolutely need to be responsive to it. But how are you going to be responsive? If your response is, I pander to your request because that seems to subdue your language or your threats, then we've actually relinquished all of our parental control over to our child. So what might we say in a moment like that is, when you say that to me, I hear that this feels very big and that's important to me. And maybe we should give a call to so-and-so right now so that we can get on this. So we we want to make sure that we're not adding more, we're not meeting secondary needs in a way that diminish our ability to provide leadership to our children. And that's kind of, it's not like, well, this is the recipe for it. This is not like you put a cup of this and a cup of this. It's not that easy like that, but we have to attune to how can I reflect back to you that that's important information you're sharing. This is what we do with that information versus you're sharing that information and now the whole family is going to do a big turnaround to accommodate to that.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds really like good advice. And I'm glad you guys are on it. You both sound like really attentive parents, and we're thinking of you. We hope it gets better soon for you. So I didn't get through my questions because you all had such fantastic questions. So we'll have to have Joan back to finish our conversation. Joan, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me, and all the best to all the families tuning in. Thank you.